Hi, I'm Molly Boyle. My colleague Vin Messina and I are going to explore the list of top finance and accounting priorities. We're going to highlight why these things are top priorities, why they're top of mind and important to CFOs, chief accounting officers, and controllers. We'll discuss what the risks are of not having the time to adequately focus on these areas, and most importantly, we'll highlight how technology like BlackLine's modern accounting platform enable finance and accounting teams to succeed. All right, so we have another good one to talk about here, and this conversation is going to be about IPO readiness. So let's start, Vin, by just kind of talking about what this really is and what an IPO means, because I think for many who read the news or the Wall Street Journal, you hear about IPOs as an exciting sort of publicity opportunity, right? Or many are quick to think that going through an IPO is a Wall Street exercise, a finance exercise, right? And you don't think about maybe some of the accounting or compliance requirements around an IPO. So first of all, just breaking down what an IPO is, right? It's really a point in time. It's sort of the end of an era and the beginning of a new era in sort of the life cycle of a company, right? So for the first time, a privately held company is making shares of its stock available on an exchange where the general public can have access to those shares. And so just to provide some context around the sheer volume of why this is a hot topic, we saw recently, I think there were over 1,000 IPOs in 2021 alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's an infusion of capital, right? You go public because you want the cash, right? And so as part of that, you have to convince investors that your organization is worthy of that investment. Mm-hmm. And so it's critical because, of course, for founders in particular, going through an IPO and then out the back end making it successful, it's worth a considerable amount of capital, you know, personally and for the organization, right? So it's not a surprise that there's so many of them out there, but then you have to take a step back and consider, what does it mean to be ready for one?
Right. Right, yeah, and to your point, there are a couple different reasons and a couple different drivers of maybe the timing of doing an IPO. Certainly, raising capital is one. Obviously, there are other ways to do that, and many private companies find ways to raise capital through, venture capitalists or what have you. But an IPO is certainly an exciting way to raise capital. It's also an opportunity, to your point, to provide liquidity back to whether it's, founders, owners, or original private investors. And also, it can be sort of a point in time, really capturing lightning in a bottle, right? Where when you have a particularly high valuation, the timing around when an IPO is most advantageous can be really sensitive. And I think we saw a lot of that with people going to the market in recent years, looking for that capital, to your point. And I guess digging in a little bit further to not just the definition of an IPO or why IPO readiness is important, but let's kind of talk a bit about what IPO readiness really involves.
Yep.
Right?
It's important. And I'm by no measure an IPO expert, but I know a couple of things. And one of the things that investors are looking at is how effective are you operationally? How efficient and effective, but do you run a good, solid business, which of course brings in the idea of talent as well as process, right? And then, do you have your financials and your tax priorities in order, right? And are the numbers over the last 2 to 3 years, do they measure up? Are the financials in good shape, if you will? And of course, both of those things are essentially in the purview of your accounting and finance team. One of them is a matter of just looking at the manual destruction if your processes are not efficient. An investor might look at that and go, not ready. And then the question you have to ask is, what happens to me if I don't get the IPO? It's not just a matter of getting it. It's a matter of you have to start looking at, why is this so important? What if I don't get it? What am I going to lose if I don't get the IPO?
Sure, yeah, significant value at stake there. Deloitte actually wrote an article or has published some leading practices recently and sort of broke down the areas of preparedness for an IPO into 3 categories. I think it was accounting and reporting, process and controls, and I know you'll love this third one, people.
People.
Right? So if we just talk a little bit about each of those and, this makes it pretty easy to see in my mind why this is,
Why are we talking
finance
about
and
this?
accounting's
Exactly,
priority.
yeah.
Why are we sitting here discussing this topic? If we talk about accounting and reporting, again, while an IPO can be a really exciting opportunity, there can be a lot of publicity and storytelling, which is what the outside world sees around an IPO. The amount of regulatory scrutiny and regulatory requirements that exist to even be able to execute on an IPO are not insignificant by any stretch of the imagination, right? So from an accounting and reporting perspective, you have to have, not only do you have to be prepared to report on an accelerated timeline in accordance with SEC guidance and requirements, right, that are much more stringent for public companies when compared to private companies. Not only do you have to do that post-IPO, you have to your point, be in a position where you can get your underwriters and other regulators through your historical financial information. And so if you don't have a process for doing that,
Trouble.
right?
Yeah, you're in a lot of trouble. I mean, it's just not going to go all that well for you. But when you just take a step back and rise it up a level, what's happening here is they're basically buying trust. The investor is buying trust. And what is the level of trust? They trust that what they're looking at is real. And they trust that based on that, they know, they have a sense of the future. So they're not just buying you today, they're buying what your potential is. They have to trust that you're representing both. And so where do accountants come into play? Both.
Right, yeah. Being able to get your underwriters, your future investors, your other key stakeholders comfortable with the completeness, the accuracy, the validity of your financial statements is clearly one of the most critical parts of IPO readiness and preparing. And so, we'll get into sort of the black line enablers here and how our platform is helping these fast-growing companies be ready, not just quickly pivot to becoming a public company, but prepare themselves or set the stage for that and allow themselves that scalability and that trust, as you said. To touch a bit on sort of that second category, though, around process and control. I think this is another one we see. I came from a fast-growing company myself. I worked in a really fast-paced accounting organization where it was exciting and where we had a lot of focus on growth and all these things. But at the end of the day, if fast-growing companies don't have processes and controls in place that are preventive in nature, that are proactive in nature, and that allow for reporting, for analytics, for insights, there's only so long that they can sustain that, right, or keep up.
What's interesting about this is the accountant's role in all of what you just said is essentially giving the investor confidence that you've got things in order today, but you're looking at the ability to scale and grow, right? Because investors invest because they view this as a high growth opportunity. Otherwise, why would they be investing, right? And so you've got to be able to demonstrate your capacity to grow, meaning your talent level, your organizational structure, your processes and control. It's not just about governance. It's about, again, the giving the investor a good sense about where it's at and can you get us there? They look at the leadership team. Do they have the capability to get us there, right? And we went through this, right? So we understand it's a pretty big shift. So you go through it, and then all of a sudden, your operational cadence is totally different. Because now there's a whole lot of third parties listening to what's going on in the organization, right?
Sure,
You've got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and when you think about process control specifically, again, a lot of companies that are fast growing, that have an influx of capital as a private company, have the luxury of sort of operating with a different focus in mind, right? But when you become a publicly traded company, you, again, not only have those things you need to do to prepare, but immediately, once you're a public company, you're subject to Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, right? And so you have to be able to build this foundation of processes and procedures that are auditable by internal and external auditors. So there's so many different considerations here. This is so much more than just telling a publicity story or capturing that lightning in a bottle, as we talked about before. I know, again, this is one of your favorite subjects, but I want to kind of touch on that people part, that third category that Deloitte highlighted. And I think there's a lot of different ways you could discuss this, but I think first and foremost, when you think about the talent that's needed, not just to prepare for or to execute an IPO, because those are some specific talents and there's great consultants and companies out there that do that, but post-IPO,
Yeah.
you need to have the skill set to be able to execute on those SEC filing requirements, to be able to provide real-time insights.
That's right.
And insights, in my mind, are critically important, and you need that people skill set, because once you become a publicly traded company, not only do you have the accelerated filing timelines and all of those things that you need to be able to execute from a compliance standpoint, but you also have that storytelling component that's critical to your investor audience.
Correct. Yeah, and it's the talent to make it happen and then beyond, having made it happen. And this is, look, the simple matter, this is what investors are looking at. And so it's a simple sort of binary equation. You're either going to get it or you're not going to get it. And these are the factors that will help. So the people side of it is absolutely a talent mix. Then it becomes a time mix, saying, well, maybe you have the right people, but they're bogged down. And we keep coming back to that same sort of formula. But we're aligning it to something that's pretty mission critical and actually holds a whole lot of value for a whole bunch of people, right? And so if we can start shifting people, then we know, for example, if we neutralize this manual work, the process is more efficient. We just know that. So why don't you just sort of start there and then take your time. Look at the control capabilities of a Blackline type solution, just organically, just by having it, you have immediate control, right? And that actually sends a great message to the investors. Like, this is what we've invested in to keep our infrastructure and our operations in check, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, how much more attractive is it to an investor for you to be able to say, we've contemplated these, important investments, we've contemplated what we need to do to execute as a publicly traded company. I think the amount of foresight that shows and preparedness that shows is not only putting you in a better place post-IPO, but also makes you a more attractive investment.
So you make a great point about the operational tempo and cadence after the IPO, because things change dramatically, as you just alluded to, and that is that your reports now have to get out by a certain time. They have to be formatted a certain way. Everybody's watching, right? So why not put all this stuff in place so that can actually happen without then becoming a tax on the team, so they can focus on other things, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of this transitionary idea of capacity where let's put this in place so that we know we are ready to deliver every 3 months what the street's looking for.
Sure, yeah. I mean, certainly there are costs associated with preparing for an IPO and executing in an IPO, but imagine as an accounting organization if you didn't have the foresight to put in place processes, controls, and technology that enabled you to grow and scale, because if you didn't, guess what? All of a sudden, imagine the cost of hiring and bringing in the bodies that are required to accelerate those timelines. So let's talk a little bit about Blackline specifically, and why Blackline, or what our platform does to enable IPO readiness or even post-IPO execution. And I was reading an article the other day. Thomson Reuters put out, I believe it was sort of a top 5 areas that you need to master in order to avoid IPO issues, right? And a couple of them really struck a chord with me. One of them, right off the bat, was accounting staff.
There you go.
Right, and so to that point, they were essentially saying that if you haven't contemplated the people that it's going to take, or the process that it's going to take to be able to execute as a publicly traded company, you're not prepared.
That's, but again, to me, it's simple. It's straightforward. It's like the people that are making this investment want to know that you got the back. You're going to take my money and you're going to turn it into something good for me. And so what's one of those variables? We talk about the right people. And this goes back to our session on recruiting and retaining top talent. Top talent seems to be coming up quite a bit, right? Talent is kind of a thing. And yeah, I focus on it because, well, it's kind of a thing. And so every single one of these sessions, you can sort of view it through the lens of, yeah, I need people to do that. And there's no difference in this one in particular. To me, you're highlighting or shedding light on real talent-oriented readiness capabilities and criteria for an IPO. And again, I always want to go back to this idea of you want the IPO because it's going to be worth it to you. So we're just here telling you, how do we fit? Where does this fit, and why and how? And then, so then you're ready. We're not telling you we're IPO experts. We're telling you that some of the criteria we can impact. So that's the way you want to think of us.
Yeah, and just to close the loop on that article I was reading, 2 of the other criteria, or 2 of the other areas that Thomson Reuters said you need to be prepared for that I think commonly cause pitfalls were around lease accounting. Something that we see our platform enable all the time. Actually, maybe a top use case that a lot of people aren't aware of, but with leases being on balance sheet, with so many complexities around being able to quantify and document these leases and then record all of the entries that are required, you know, that's for us at Blackline a well-known use case. But for many, you know, something that you might think, oh, I need to go buy a specific lease accounting software. I need to go, you know, focus on this siloed area. Well, no, that's just another opportunity to address another accounting challenge with a purpose-built solution that can solve a lot of different problems. And one of the other, one of the other areas was around reporting, which is no surprise, but specifically around segment reporting and being able to roll up information in a, you know, rapid and consistent and reliable fashion.
Reliable is the key. Yeah. Reliable is the key there, and rapid too. They both come in hand. Because I always talk about what does a horse and buggy have in common with a green sheet and number 2 pencil. Well, both of them work, but they just take a really long time. Right? You can close the books of $1 billion company with a green sheet and number 2 pencil. It's going to take you a long time. So the fact that, and you're probably going to have some errors. The fact of the matter is that's what we're talking about here. It's got to be quick, much quicker than before, and it has to be much more, because it's going to be inspected. The reliability has to be there. And so, and of course, what's at stake? Your share price. I mean, that's what's at stake. You know what I'm saying? If you screw any of this up over the years and your price doesn't rise, and that's kind of the goal, right?
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, so if you think about a few of the things that our platform is best known for and does sort of out of the box, if you will, a lot of that is around sort of built-in leading practices, right? Things like segregation of duties, which are a key component of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance for publicly traded companies, right? Why scramble? Why invent a new manual process or, you know, a new homegrown process if you're preparing for an IPO when you can leverage technology to bring you some of those leading practices? And then I think, again, if we think about the core capabilities of the platform around things like balance sheet substantiation, orchestration and management of overall close processes, and really, to me, another sort of not often highlighted capability within the platform is really around audit preparedness and transparency in terms of orchestrating audit processes, right? If you need to share, especially in today's remote and hybrid work environment when we don't have the luxury to be on site with our auditors or in some cases our underwriters while you're preparing, if you can retain all this critical documentation, whether it's policies, procedures, supporting documents, in a cloud platform where there's only one version of the truth, imagine the amount of confusion, imagine the amount of version control issues and the amount of trust, those are the things you can avoid, and then the amount of trust and transparency you can bring, you know, right out of the gate as a newly public company with your auditors.
And I had, as you were talking too, I had a visual of bobsledding, right? And in bobsledding, it's hilarious. It came to my mind when you're in a bobsledding. You know, your initial thrust is like everybody's pushing the sled, if it's like a 4-man sled team, right? And then you get in and you take off. Can you ultimately reach that speed if you don't have that initial push? Yeah, it's just going to take you a while. So what Blackline can do for an organization in an IPO, because that's what an IPO really wants to do. You want to get going, you know, and your growth expectations are much higher than they were before. So what does putting the right base in? It's like that push off. So put it in and you're ready to go. And then you just accelerate faster. And because you're basically doing, the administrative stuff is covered, and so the people can spend their time doing those things that enable that trajectory. That's really what I was listening for and listening to, but I think that's actually a pretty fair visual image of what we do.
Yeah, I like it.
Cool.